The cowboy heard her screams in the barn. He broke the door and said she's free now. The land stretched wide and empty, a pale sky leaning over dry fields where winter's wind carried only the sound of brittle grass breaking under its own weight. A narrow dirt road cut across the silence, its ruts frozen from the night cold, and beside it stood a weathered barn, its boards grey and warped from years of storms. No smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin near it, no voices carried from the porch, only the hollow groan of a loose shutter knocking against wood in the restless wind. It was the kind of morning where the world felt abandoned, where every sound echoed too loud and every silence carried a weight of its own. The cowboy rode slow, reins slack in his hand, shoulders heavy inside a coat gone thin with wear. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face carved by years of dust, hunger, and long rides under hard suns. His horse's breath came out in small white clouds, breaking the stillness with each step, the sound of hooves muted by frost-hardened earth. He had ridden this road 100 times before and thought it carried nothing new. Yet today the quiet was not natural. It was the wrong kind of silence, the sort that prickled at the back of the neck and made a man sit taller in his saddle. He slowed the horse near the barn. Its roof sagged, one door hanging loose, the smell of old hay drifting faintly. From within came a sound that cut through the morning like a knife. At first it was muffled, a rustling he thought might be an animal caught in the straw. But then came the scream. Sharp, desperate, torn out from somewhere deep, it filled the barn and then choked itself back into silence as if swallowed. The cowboy froze, his hand tightening around the reins, his jaw locking against the sudden burn in his chest. Dismounting, his boots sank into the cold dirt, spurs giving a dull jingle that sounded too loud. He approached, slow, his breath quickening, eyes fixed on the gap between the boards, where darkness pressed against the light outside. Another cry, weaker this time, rose from within, followed by the rattling of chains against wood. His hand brushed the worn handle of the revolver at his side, but he did not draw it. Instead, he pressed forward, each step heavy with a mixture of dread and something else, something like a memory clawing its way up from a place he had buried long ago. He reached the door, rough under his calloused palm, and pushed. It would not move. A heavy bar locked it from the inside, trapping whatever pain lived within. His chest tightened at the sound of a soft sob, too human, too broken to mistake. He stepped back, set his jaw, and with one hard kick, the old wood cracked against the frame. Another strike, and the door splintered, the light rushing in over dust and hay. The scream ended in silence, and what he saw made the world go still around him. She was crouched in the corner, wrists bound by rusted chains hooked to an old beam, her dress torn and her knees drawn tight to her chest, as if the smaller she made herself, the safer she might be. Her hair clung in damp strands to her face, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that had lived too long inside her. She did not scream now. She only stared, trembling, waiting for the blow she had learned always followed after making a sound. The cowboy stood in the broken doorway, the splinters under his boot, his chest tight as he looked at her. He had seen men broken by war, animals left to starve, but this was different. This was the kind of wound no bullet could make, no medicine could heal. For a long moment neither moved. His breath misted in the cold air, hers caught in shallow bursts like a bird trapped inside a cage. He wanted to step closer, but the memory of another time, another girl, stopped him. He saw again the face of his sister, younger than him by 10 years, standing barefoot in the dust outside their father's cabin, eyes blackened by a man's temper that was not his own. He had ridden away that day, too young and too angry to fight back, and when he returned years later, the house was gone. The girl buried in the small graveyard behind the church. That failure lived in him like a stone, and now, as he watched this stranger flinch from every shift of his boot, the stone pressed heavier. He told himself to walk away. The world was cruel, and a man who took on someone else's pain often drowned in it. He had barely kept himself afloat, drifting from one ranch to another, never staying, never building, never allowing himself to carry more than his own weight. If he cut her loose, the men who chained her might come hunting, and if he left her, maybe she would die, but it would not be his blood on the ground. The choice gnawed at him, each side heavier than the other, yet his feet would not turn from the sight before him. She did not ask for help. She did not lift her eyes in plea. She simply sat there, shivering, silent, waiting for fate to decide her worth. And that silence struck him harder than any scream. It was the silence of giving up, the silence his sister must have known before her last breath, the silence of a soul that no longer believed anyone might come. He stepped forward, slow, hands open, his voice low and rough when he finally spoke. "You're free now," he said, though he knew the words were not yet true. She flinched, but did not turn away. He reached for the chain, tested the lock, and with one hard pull, the rust gave way and the metal clattered to the dirt. She curled tighter, expecting hurt, but none came. He stood over her, shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had just chosen. Walking away was no longer an option. He had taken her burden onto his own back, and from this moment on, her survival was bound to his. The barn smelled of dust and old hay, but beneath it was another scent, one sea, harp and metallic, like dried blood that clung to the wood. The girl stayed curled where she was, her arms wrapped around herself, eyes darting to the broken doorway, as if she feared someone else might appear at any moment. The cowboy crouched down a few feet away, close enough to show he wasn't leaving, far enough to give her space. His voice came low, steady, the way he might speak to a frightened colt. "Who did this?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. She said nothing, lips pressed tight, but the way her gaze flicked to the far corner told him enough. He followed her eyes and saw marks carved into the beam. Tallies, dozens of them, maybe more. Each one cut into the wood with a blade, each one a day, or a night, or some twisted count of suffering. His gut tightened. This wasn't a single act of cruelty. It was a pattern. Someone had kept her here, hidden her, punished her, and planned to return. The silence of the place was not safety. It was a pause, a gap between storms, and storms never waited long. From outside, the faint crunch of hooves reached his ears. The cowboy froze, his hand instinctively brushing the grip of his revolver. He glanced at the girl, and her body stiffened, her breath shallow, as if she knew exactly what that sound meant. Whoever chained her wasn't gone. They were close, maybe watching, maybe circling back. He rose to his feet, his heart drumming in a rhythm he hadn't felt since war, the kind that warned him time was about to run short. The girl finally whispered, her voice cracked and thin. "He'll kill me if I leave." Her words barely reached him, but they carried the weight of truth. She didn't name him, but fear made the picture clear enough. This was no stranger, no random tormentor. This was family, or someone who thought they owned her. A father, a brother, a man with rights twisted into weapons. And if she believed death, was certain, it meant the man was cruel enough to make that promise real. The cowboy's mind worked quick. If he stayed here, they'd be trapped when the owner of those hoofbeats arrived. If he fled with her, he'd be marked, hunted, dragged into a fight he hadn't asked for. But looking at her shaking hands, the raw skin at her wrists where the chains had bitten, he knew the fight had already begun. The moment he broke that door, he declared himself her shield. The hoofbeats grew louder, more than one horse now, moving fast down the frozen road. Men's voices carried faintly, harsh and careless, words he couldn't make out, but tones he recognized too well. Predators. He stepped toward her, crouched again, and met her eyes. "You want to stay here and die, or ride with me and take your chance?" For a breath, she didn't answer. Then, with the smallest nod, she chose. He pulled her to her feet, steadying her when her legs gave out beneath her, and led her toward the back of the barn. The front was no longer an exit. It was a trap, waiting to close. He shoved aside a stack of rotting boards, revealing a gap just wide enough to slip through. Behind them, voices grew louder, closer. The threat was no longer coming. It had arrived. And now, both their lives hung on the thin thread of escape. They rode hard through the back fields until the land opened into low hills where the cottonwoods thinned and the creek cut its silver line through the frost. The cowboy did not look back, though he heard the distant shouts of men and the pounding of hooves fading into the other direction. He chose a trail few knew, one that bent toward the mountains, and only when the sun dipped low and his horse's flanks foamed with sweat did he stop. They reached a hollow where the wind was blocked by stone and the creek offered water. He swung down, helped her from the saddle, and for the first time since the barn, her knees did not buckle. She stood on her own, though her hands shook as she held to the horse's mane. He built a fire with steady hands, his movements quiet, practiced, saying nothing he did know. At need to. She watched from the shadow of a rock, her arms tight around her body, as if warmth was something she didn't trust yet. When the flames caught, he set a tin pot over them and poured in what little beans he carried. The smell rose into the air, simple and earthy, and after a while her eyes followed it. He didn't offer right away. He waited until she edged closer, until hunger pulled stronger than fear, and only then did he hand her the tin. She took it, head bowed, eating slow, as if each bite might be taken from her. Later, he drew his revolver, checked the chamber, then set it on the log between them. She tensed, her body pulling back. He picked it up, held it out, grip first. She shook her head, but he kept it steady until she reached for it with trembling fingers. He showed her how to hold it, how to keep her thumb away from the hammer, how to line the sights on a broken bottle set against the rock. Her hands shook too much to fire, but when she tried, the echo cracked through the hollow, and for the first time he saw something new flicker in her face. Not joy, not yet, but a small spark of power. The sound had been hers. The choice had been hers. When the fire burned low, he pulled off his coat and set it across her shoulders. She resisted, then let it fall over her, the weight of it heavy but warmer than the night. As she leaned into the fabric, her eyes caught the scar that ran across his knuckles, jagged and pale against weathered skin. She touched her own wrist where the chains had cut, and for a breath, silence bound them tighter than any words could. He looked into the flames, remembering nights in the trenches, remembering the sound of his sister's voice when she begged him not to go. She had been lost because he left, and he carried that guilt like a brand. She too had been abandoned, and though neither spoke, they both knew the shape of the SA. Me wound. The night deepened, the stars sharp above them, and for a brief, fragile span of time the world was only firelight, the hush of the creek, and two broken souls sitting close enough to share breath. It felt almost like peace, the kind that comes before the storm remembers where you are. The dawn came cold and colorless, the fire burned down to ash, and the creek whispered low against its stones. The cowboy had not slept, his eyes fixed on the faint trail beyond the hollow, listening for what he knew would come. She lay wrapped in his coat, her breath shallow but steady, the first unbroken sleep she had likely known in weeks. He wished he could let her rest longer, but the sound of hooves came early, carried sharp on the morning air. More than one horse, more than one rider. The hunt had found them. He rose, shaking her shoulder gently, and she woke with fear already in her eyes. He put a finger to his lips, then handed her the revolver she had held the night before. Her hands trembled as she gripped it, but she did not refuse. He stepped out into the clearing just as the first rider appeared between the trees, a broad man with a crooked jaw and the same dark eyes he had seen in the girl. Behind him rode three others, guns slung loose, faces mean and certain. The girl gasped softly, and the cowboy knew at once. This was family, the kind that claimed blood as ownership, the kind that called cruelty a right. The man with the crooked jaw dismounted, boots crunching on frost, his smile wide and cruel. "That's my property you took," he said, his voice carrying the easy tone of someone who had never been told no. He gestured toward the girl without even looking at her, as though she were a horse or a cow gone strayed. "Hand her back, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." The cowboy said nothing. He stood still, his hand near his holster, his shoulders set against the weight of 4 rifles aimed his way. The girl stepped from behind the rock, the revolver shaking in her grasp, her face pale but her eyes burning. For the first time she faced the man who had chained her. His smile faltered at the sight of her standing beside another, armed, no longer silent. The cowboy glanced at her, a small nod, not of command, but of trust. It was her fight, as much as his now. The standoff stretched, Time held on the thin line between breath and blood. The cowboy's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the knowledge that one move would mean the end. Then the crooked-jawed man sneered, spitting in the dirt. "You think you can save her? You think she wants saving? Ask her who she killed. Ask her why we keep her locked away." The words struck like a whip. The cowboy turned his eyes to her, but she did not flinch. Tears burned down her face, but her voice was steady when she whispered, "I tried to stop him. I tried to stop what he was doing to me." The twist hung heavy. The man she had killed had not been a stranger, but another of their own, one who had crossed the last line. The silence that followed shattered in an instant. The crooked-jawed man lunged, rifle lifting, and the cowboy drew faster than thought, his shot cracking through the hollow. Chaos broke loose, fire and smoke filling the clearing. He moved not for himself, but for her, placing his body between her and the bullets, every strike a gamble against death. One man fell. Another's horse reared, but still they pressed forward. The cowboy felt the burn of pain as a round tore through his side, yet he held steady, teeth gritted, his revolver steady, until the last man dropped his weapon and fled. When it was done, he staggered, blood soaking through his shirt, but he stayed on his feet long enough to look at her. She was still standing, the revolver clutched in her hands, her eyes locked on him, not with fear, but with something deeper, something like belief. He had risked everything, and though death pressed close, he knew the choice had been right. He had stood where he once failed, Ed, and this time he had not walked away. Smoke drifted thin through the trees, curling around the bodies that lay still on the frozen ground. The air smelled of gunpowder and blood, sharp and bitter, and the silence that followed the storm was heavier than any sound. The cowboy stood swaying, one hand pressed hard to his side where the bullet had torn through him, his breath ragged, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. The girl dropped the revolver from her trembling hands and rushed to him, but he raised a hand to slow her, his eyes steady despite the pain. The crooked-jawed man lay a few feet away, not dead, but groaning, clutching the dirt with bloodied fingers. His face twisted in rage and defeat, but his voice was weak. "She'll never be free," he spat, the words dragging out like poison. The cowboy looked at him once, long enough to know the fight was over. He turned his back, a choice louder than any bullet. Some men did not need killing. Their own cruelty would finish them in time. The girl pressed against his arm, her small hands trying to steady him as he stumbled back toward the horse. His blood left dark stains on her skin, but she did not let go. She guided him step by step, her bare feet raw against the ground, until they reached the animal. He gritted his teeth and pulled himself into the saddle, then leaned down to lift her up behind him. She climbed with effort, her arms wrapping around him, holding not from fear, but from the fragile strength of someone who refused to let go again. They rode slow, the horse weary, the land stretching empty ahead of them. The sun had begun to rise, pale gold washing over the hills, softening the edges of the world. Neither spoke. There was nothing left in words. His body leaned heavy against hers, and still she held him upright, her cheek pressed to his back, listening to the unsteady rhythm of his breath. Every jolt of the trail sent a shudder through him, but he did not complain, and she did not loosen her hold. When they reached the creek again, he pulled the horse to a stop and slid down, nearly falling. She was at his side in an instant, helping him to the water's edge. He sank to his knees, washing the blood from his hands, his reflection trembling in the current. She knelt beside him, dipped her own hand into the cold stream, and without a word began to clean the wound at his side. He hissed against the sting, but did not pull away. Her touch was clumsy, unskilled, but it carried something stronger than medicine. Care. The world narrowed to the sound of water, the breath of the horse, and their silence together. The danger had passed, but the weight of it lingered. He looked at her, saw the chains no longer on her wrists, and knew freedom was not a moment but a road. Still, as she sat with him on the bank, her hand steady against his wound, it felt as if the first step had been taken. The storm had ended. What remained was the long, quiet work of living. Winter passed into spring, and the land softened under new grass and the pale bloom of wildflowers that pushed through the thawed earth. The cabin he once kept empty now breathed with another presence, her small footsteps moving across the worn floorboards, her careful hands lighting the fire before dusk. The cowboy healed slow, the scar at his side a constant reminder of the fight, but he found himself rising each morning with a steadiness he had long thought lost. She no longer flinched at every sound, no longer shrank into shadows. Though silence still lingered in her eyes, it was no longer the silence of surrender, but of watchfulness, of learning how to live again. They never spoke much of the men who had hunted them, nor of the days in the barn. Instead, they built small routines. She mended his shirts with clumsy stitches. He taught her how to plant beans in the garden out back, how to cut wood without splitting the grain, how to listen for the storm before it broke. Some nights, when the world outside grew too still, she would sit at the table, tracing the scars on her wrists as he polished the revolver that had saved them both. The weight of their pasts hung between them, yet neither tried to carry it alone. In their quiet acts, in their shared silence, they carved something like peace. One morning, he found her outside by the small patch of earth where she had buried the chain links he had broken. She stood with her head bowed, a single flower pressed into the soil, as if laying to rest not just the metal, but the years it had stolen. He did not disturb her. He only watched, knowing some graves were not for bodies but for pain itself. Time moved forward, unmarked by calendars, measured only by the growth of crops and the steady rhythm of two lives no longer lived apart. He had once believed he was meant to ride alone until the end. She had once believed no door would ever open for her again. Yet here they were, two broken souls who found each other not by chance, but by the sound of a scream carried through the winter air. And when the wind rose across the fields, carrying the smell of rain and earth, it seemed to whisper back the words he had spoken that first day in the barn. She's free now.